Okay, this is Policed, Punished, Dehumanized, The Reality for Young Men of Color Living in America by Victor Rios from Race, Class, Gender, 10th edition. So the reading starts from his personal experience of constant police harassment and brutality, which made him normalize police violence in his community. His younger brother was even beaten by a gang of notorious police officers called the Riders, and their complaints of brutality went ignored. So the difference between then and now, in his analysis, is that a critical mass of young Black and Latino men are being killed by police and vigilantes, and this is something that has become a household conversation, with a national spotlight and some media attention on the issue. So the attention provides a new opportunity to expose the problem of state-sanctioned violence on marginalized populations, and to cultivate a social movement to oppose or dismantle the brutal punitive state. Rios also connects this to high-profile killings, from Oscar Grant to Trayvon Martin, Eric Gardner, Andy Lopez, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, and more recently, of course, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. All of these killings stem from an unchecked system of punitive social control that criminalizes young people of color at early ages. And of course, more than just those high-profile killings, there's so many names. And that's really the key to it. For the ones that we see, the ones that receive national media spotlight, are just the tip of the iceberg of these kind of brutal, punitive, state-sanctioned brutality and killings. So, Rios also points out, though, that many more Americans who live in poverty do survive or are not murdered at the hands of police or vigilantes, but they do experience what he calls a social death, or a social incapacitation, in which they're rendered as criminal suspects by police, schools, community centers, social workers, merchants, community members, and even their own families. So by the time these kids become young adults, their lives have already been policed, punished, and dehumanized by various social institutions in their lives. And this hypercriminalization empowers and emboldens the criminal justice system, the police, and the vigilantes to harass, arrest, and really treat these young men unfairly. So this youth control complex, the coalescing of various social institutions to punish, stigmatize, and dehumanize marginalized young people, which then provides the justification to use state violence against them. So society criminalizes marginalized young people so much that when they're killed, their name has already been rendered as deserving draconian punishments, including death. We saw this with Trayvon Martin, right? The conservative media focusing on the fact that he got in trouble at school once for marijuana, as if that justifies a vigilante murdering him. Now we're hearing this bullshit from right-wing extremists that George Floyd died of a drug overdose, when everybody saw the video of Derek Chauvin kneeling on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, murdering him, fully aware that his cause of death is state-sanctioned police violence. The hope that Rios has is that with the moment of attention of people paying attention to these issues of police brutality, of these vigilante killings, that then people are going to be able to organize a viable social movement that will be able to dismantle the punitive state that leads to all of these unnecessary killings and untold amount of suffering, from actual death or from the social death that he's observed in the lives of his participants. So often, he's looking at crimes of survival and crimes of resistance. So these are concepts he doesn't really develop in this article, but he does develop more in other readings. But just in brief, to give you kind of a snapshot, an example of a crime of survival would be a property crime, that someone steals something to sell it so that they can, pay their rent or eat that day, right? So people committing a crime to survive. And an example of a crime of resistance he outlines in another article. One example he gives is stealing a bag of potato chips, which a young man does because he thought the punitive policies of a shopkeeper was unfair. So it's obviously a very petty crime, right? It's like less than $2. But the store owner called the cops on the young man, and he was criminalized over something that a lot of young people do. But he was Latino, and his actions were perceived as threatening and not as a reaction to being treated like a criminal. So Rios builds on Howard Becker's labeling theory that youth internalize their label, and what results is then to commit more crime. But Rios argues that what's missing from Becker's analysis is that some who are labeled engage in resistance and generate action that seeks to change the system that oppresses them. Okay, moving on to punitive social control and social incapacitation. Black men are killed by police or vigilantes every 28 hours in America. And many people dismiss these murders by the legal system as legitimate, which connects to his analysis of criminalization. These realities have emboldened vigilantes, and at this point in history, literal white supremacist militias that see how the culture places little value on the lives of black and brown populations, and this encourages their increasing violence. So again, Rios talks about the social death, which he describes as a slow and devastating process, or the systematic process by which individuals are denied their humanity. They may avoid or survive the killings or brutality, but they're socially isolated, they're violated, and prevented from engaging in social relationships that can affirm their humanity. So this is part of the incarceration issue, but outside of that, these youth are criminalized before they come in contact with the system, and beyond that, face microaggressions as a form of social death, or what he calls social incapacitation, which is the process of dehumanization by which punitive social control becomes an instrument that prevents marginalized populations from becoming productive citizens who can then feel dignity and affirmation from the institutions of socialization. So many youth realize that they're being punished for being poor, black, Latino, or male. And because of the war on drugs and the era of mass incarceration, the punitive state is the norm. So these young men are viewed through that lens and are targeted as criminal risks. So Rios argues that this process creates a generation of young people who are blocked from even basic affirmation of their humanity, let alone opportunities that could afford them some sort of social mobility. Okay, so when it comes to criminalization, criminalization does not only occur in the law. Other institutions that are important to socialization also engage in this criminalization process, such as schools, communities, and even families. So young men's deviant and non-deviant behavior is constantly treated as a threat. Rios calls this ubiquitous criminalization as a youth control complex, a system in which schools, police, probation officers, families, community centers, businesses, and other institutions collaborate to treat young people's everyday behavior as criminal activity. So this also connects to hypercriminalization, which is the process by which an individual's non-deviant behavior and everyday interactions become treated as risk, threat, or crime, and in turn have an impact on their perceptions and their worldview, and really their life outcomes. He further argues that the youth control complex creates an overarching system regulating the lives of young people, this punitive social control. And so the youth control complex is connected to the ways that poor and racialized populations have been controlled throughout American history. It's important to understand how this is not new, how this criminalization is linked to racial criminalization throughout American history. Modern-day police brutality and state-sanctioned violence cannot be separated from slavery that normalize holding people hostage and torturing them. The slave patrols themselves have a legacy connected to policing and police brutality today. Lynching and racist mobs connect to vigilante killers today, like George Zimmerman, or the El Paso mass murderer that was inspired by Trump's fear-mongering about immigrants. He drove to El Paso and murdered 23 people and injured an additional 23 people when he entered a Walmart store in August of 2019. So punishment of brown bodies today connects to the genocide of indigenous populations in the past and the cultural genocide that followed. Also the appropriation of Mexico, which was stolen and became the West of the United States, and the vigilante and police brutality against groups within the West, such as, the so-called bandidos, or against immigrants in general, or, the famous Zoot Suiters, right? Or all of this connected how people criminalize youth today, especially members of gangs. So when you look at the long-term historical view, you can see how the connections between the violence, the subordination, the criminalization of the past, and those kind of threads that run through to today. Okay, so when it comes to criminalization itself, it is often well disguised as a protective mechanism. And so zero-tolerance policies at schools are supposedly there to protect students, right? In the same way that more punitive policing is supposed to protect the good citizens from the scary gang members, right? And the ideology of longer prison sentences is supposed to keep dangerous people away from society, though obviously we know through the war on drugs that a large proportion of the people locked up are there for non-violent drug offenses and not for violent crimes. So, various institutions collaborate to form a system that degrades and dishonors these young men on an everyday basis. So the young men learn that their world is punitive and that they don't receive second chances. And so while the institutions themselves are separate, they intersect with one another to provide a consistent flow of criminalization, right? From home to school to the community to the businesses in the community, etc., right? So the youth control complex adds to young people's blocked opportunities, but it also generates a creative response, which allows the boys to feel dignified. Boys push back by adopting a subculture of resistance based on fooling the system and by committing crimes of resistance which make no sense to the system but were fully recognizable to those who have been criminalized. So Rios argues that paradoxically, punitive social control also creates deep self-awareness of the class position that the young men are in. So they understand the process of punishment. They're not just victims of a system or victims of a label, they have agency and political awareness. So they have an idea of how the system is impacting their everyday lives. So in response, their actions, their subcultures, their worldviews then are developed in direct opposition to the punitive social control that they experience in their everyday lives from all of these different institutions. So resistance itself, he argues, carries the seeds of redemption, self-determination, resilience, and desistance. So Rios argues we need to teach people how to use this resistance to navigate mainstream institutions, and we need to grant less damaging consequences for young people who break the law.